that's okay. So for those who don't know me, my name is Wes Geisenberger. I help lead the Sustainable Impact Fund at the HBAR Foundation. The HBAR Foundation is a grant-giving organization in the Hedera ecosystem. And I also serve as the chair for the Carbon Emissions Task Force as part of the IWA within the GBBC. For those who don't know, Hedera is a public layer 1 technology, very similar in a sense to some of the other technologies you heard from today. Proof of stake network has a low carbon footprint, but it's governed by some of the largest organizations in the world across industries and geographies. So folks like Google, Tata, IBM, Avery Dennison, ServiceNow, Electricité de France, and many of these organizations are pioneering use cases across the enterprise, but our network's open for anyone to build and drive change. And a lot of what we do is focused on digital public goods. And those digital public goods are enabling not only the use cases, but world-changing outcomes. And one of the things that we really think about at the foundation as part of the Hedera ecosystem is the balance sheet of the planet will live on the public ledger. So when I think about it from a carbon emissions task force perspective, that could be scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 emissions, product carbon footprints. We hear a lot about supply chain issues and assets having digital birth certificates. I know Dale talked a little bit about being able to track packages and understanding different elements about them. But what about the goods that we're consuming? Understanding not just the digital birth certificate, but maybe the amount of water consumed for that good, maybe the amount of carbon created with that good. We also think about markets where things like carbon offsets come into play. We may have water rights markets, renewable energy trading markets. And we think all of these assets need to be auditable and understand the different roles and actors involved in an audit trail, the data that's being produced, but that data needs to be understandable. It needs to be information that's discoverable. And if there is trading involved, say where you're offsetting a carbon emission, you need to be able to see the emission, the entire audit trail of the emission, the offset, and actually prove that those assets are real. And so we have 5 goals as part of our investment fund. When we announced the fund back in early last year, it was a $100 million fund. We wanted to support 5 goals as part of that fund. One is to make climate finance auditable, understand where money comes from, where it goes to. If we think about sustainable debt mechanisms in a multi-trillion-dollar green bond market, or the multi-billion-dollar the voluntary carbon market, or the compliance carbon market, which is growing and complemented by other things like biodiversity markets, which are already quite big in a compliance sense in the US, but growing voluntarily internationally. All those proceeds, we need to understand that they're following different rules, and the money's going to specific folks who are following those rules in a way that's trustworthy, that we can understand the outcome. And we can understand the outcome to the unit of value, such as a metric ton, a biodiversity area being improved or conserved, or maybe we're tracking and making sure our emissions are really following the right accounting rules. Because when we buy a product, we can't always see what pollution came out of it. When we buy a carbon credit, we may not know what happened halfway around the world and was it following a credible set of rules. Of course, we need to make sure that someone's not just putting that information on a blockchain or distributed ledger. We need to scale validation and verification for independent audits of those assets that are being created. Putting those rules out there on a public ledger is a good way to start, but making sure the data is following those rules is an important element of that. And when we have this data, we can create dynamic attributes. So we heard a lot about supply chain use cases today. We heard about financial tracing of funds and understanding how we may think about payments in the future. But we need to discover a global climate asset price where we understand the payment that's happening on chain for the real world asset. And that real world asset is backed up by an audit trail that follows rules. And so we're developing net new technologies, that open source infrastructure to enable that as part of our goals, as part of our investments, at both the infrastructure and application level, because these assets sit on company balance sheets. When we think about ESG reporting, oftentimes we hear questions about credibility. We hear questions about, well, is what I see in the annual report with the really nice pictures, is that really happening? Are we enabling this impact? And if we have those rules out there, if we have data out there that is tied to units of value on a public ledger that anyone can see and help trace, it gives us a much better chance to say, yes, that's in fact happening. And so as part of our investments of that open source infrastructure, we talked about the methodologies, those rule sets that we're following, and mapping actors who are producing data, whether it's a device or person or a third-party system. That all can be logged. A lot of times people talk about blockchain, and we talk about the logs of information that are stored. They're oftentimes small pieces of information that add up over time, where we need to prove the provenance of that information cryptographically. But if we have the rules out there and we can have deterministic rules that are programs effectively, and codification of data, we can get to that unit of outcome. And so on Hedera, we have different systems that enable this, and I'm not going to get into today, but the open source tool that structures that data is called the Guardian. It's one of our biggest public investments in terms of infrastructure. The digital public good that anyone can use today, You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to talk to Hedera. You can start to use it to codify those rules, where we've already done so with actually the largest library of rules out there in the world for emissions tracking, voluntary carbon market assets, and many other rule sets are being defined even as we speak. And of course, the reason why folks are creating these rules is so they can develop environmental projects, develop emissions tracking, and create markets that can rationalize how an offset's happening in real time for an emission that's happening in real time. And the idea is, well, this has to be adopted, right? Where is this happening? So we have folks like ServiceNow, Fortune 500 organization, one of our governing council members. They're not only a stakeholder in helping govern the technology and the finance of Hedera, as well as set the technical roadmap, but they're actually using these tools and these open source tools on top of Hedera, called the Guardian, embedded within their platform, where you have Hedera as the layer one, the Guardian as an API that you can access, and effectively structure the data of the rules and the data against those rules to get to the unit of outcome, where they have customers who are creating renewable energy certificates in Southeast Asia to do just that. And that maybe you say, hey, well, what about startups? How are we working with smaller organizations? Well, we have folks who, if they want to get started, we had a developer put this together for a hackathon. One of our goals with the Guardian is in less than 2 weeks you can define these complex environmental rule sets in simplified views. And we took a process from Gold Standard to take an electrified cook stove and how they measure emission reductions through clean cooking. And we took all the different roles, laid them out, again, through this hackathon, through a single developer. And he was able to win the hackathon by codifying all these rules and get to a point where you can map every role, every actor, each piece of data being produced, cook stove, different parties involved, to get to what would be a metric ton in the case of a project. So if one developer can do this, and that can apply to people in the developing world who are using clean cooking as a way to not pollute as much, well, how does that really impact those communities? It's one of the things that we often think about in climate finance and voluntary carbon markets. Well, if we have the roles mapped out within a methodology, and those roles and actors you're fulfilling them are attesting to data, all of a sudden we can start to map the data flows that are coming, but we can also receive value in those accounts on public ledgers. And we've heard, in climate markets and carbon markets lately, about maybe that's an issue if the communities who are, making these changes in sustainable development, are they getting paid? That's a big question that we've heard from a climate justice perspective, or folks on Wall Street getting richer by funding these projects and paying someone a small piece of that carbon credit, and then making money selling it again and again. We don't even know if it's real every time. But if we put the rules out there, the data out there, and we can show the receipt of value into those accounts using tools like stablecoins, well, maybe we can actually answer the question, what percentage of funds went back to the community? What contractors involved in a carbon credit project, an independent verifier, a registry, the keeper of the rules, or a project developer, the folks who are the consultants helping make the project possible, what are they getting paid versus what is the community getting paid? Maybe we can actually answer the question of that percentage, or even how the community is using those funds, and are they traceable? Does that add value to the project? And so the Guardian helps structure that data. But we have native on-ledger payment processes that actually show how that's remitting. And so Tolam, one of the marketplaces on Hedera, is working to make that an attribute in the markets. Now, they're also developing a price oracle. You can think of that as a way to predict a price. In a different correlated market, if you're going to go sell your house, you may look on Zillow and say, what does Zillow think my house is worth? Imagine you could take all the attributes, not just the rule set someone's following or the data, and you could look at every single piece of data and value, just like you would for your house, what that carbon credit may be worth based on the data you're actually producing, based on new attributes like what percentage of funds go back to the community. We hear a lot about climate justice, but you would think you would want financial transparency to be part of that equation. And so we have these tools called ARMS that can do that at scale. They can matchmake the demand for credits based on emissions and do purchases based on attributes to show how you're reducing emissions in supply chains, the carbon reduction in the more developed world. But we can also show the economic outcome in the developing world. What often is economic development for these communities? Making sure your fisheries are well stocked, but in order to do that, you maybe have to plant mangroves, which is a carbon reduction. Those fisheries being well stocked means the community is eating well. They have a fresh supply of fish. They don't have to move to a city. Those sustainable development activities oftentimes could be attributes as part of a project, but today oftentimes are left out or are a brand-driven market approach. And so when we try to take this into a more understandable context, it's Well, we use the Guardian, this digital measurement reporting and verification protocol, to transparently show something like emissions. We could be creating emissions tokens following standards developed by the GBBC and IWA. We could see that audit trail on a public ledger. We could understand what that audit trail actually means. We can understand what is an emission, scope 1, 2, or 3 as part of an organization. We can do the same thing of a mapped rule set for a carbon credit. Understand the roles, the actors, the data produced, what is valuable about that credit and why we think it's valuable, maybe even to the point of payment to the community. And with the ARMs, we can help settle that transaction. And so we have folks like Avery Dennison. For those who don't know Avery Dennison, if you reach in the back of your shirt and you touch the label, they've probably made it. We're one of the world's largest digital trigger for RFID, NFC focused companies, and they create labels that touch just about every public good that you touch or any private good that's sold. And what they're doing on Hedera is they're logging billions of transactions. And those billions of transactions are tied to digital product passports, all unique items. And of course, as part of that product passport, you can carry an emissions profile. Now, if you carry an emissions profile and you log that to a public ledger, you can understand the source of not only the goods, but you can also say, well, if I'm calculating my scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions, if I'm calculating a product carbon footprint, that's where maybe I want to offset as the emission's happening. And you may want to even understand that. And we can tie these things together from when I buy a trusted carbon credit to a carbon emissions token, all on a public ledger, all with interactive use cases. You could do the same thing with renewable energy credits like ServiceNow is doing for your scope 2 emissions for the energy consumption. You can bring these assets together to solve real world problems and outcomes where you can show with provenance the data, the finance, and how it all links together. And as we think about this, we're talking about blockchain for impact. I can't think of anything more impactful than every single good that we touch being traceable and affecting local communities to drive sustainable outcomes. So I just want to say thank you for the time. Thank you for GBBC for having us, and appreciate all the comments afterwards. Thank you.